Hello, everyone. We are live, and hopefully everything's working well. Let us know in the comments, as I always say, if there's anything that on a technical level needs to be corrected. But we are back with our show that has no name yet,
That might
talking
be
to
the name.
the no name show. But it's both of us here today: Tim Frisch from a Frisch perspective, and Nicholas, the Layman Apologist. Great to have you with me again, talking about great topics.
Yep, great
Yeah,
to be back.
yeah, we're gonna dig in today to this book we have up here, "The Sin of Empathy." Just the title is enough to spark discussion. The Sin of
Mhm.
Empathy. So we're going to talk about why it's called that. And the author Joe Rigney actually in the book gives a pretty sturdy defense of this title. He has a whole appendix dedicated to defending the title, but he has a lot of other stuff in here. And as people are coming in, we'd just love to see who's in the chat here. I'll try to keep an eye. I know Nicholas will be able to keep an eye
Yeah.
on people that are commenting, but I see we do have Dwayne Green, and
How
let
you
me
doing?
pull up. He says, "What's up?" Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Finally caught one of our lives, he said.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's two in a row there, Dwayne. That's awesome. And Dwayne has a great channel. I think I've said this before, but I just want to make sure everyone knows Dwayne Green. If you go to his channel, he's done a lot talking about textual issues with the Bible, the majority text, Textus Receptus, critical text, all of those types of issues regarding the New Testament. So great to see you, Dwayne. And I know he's up in Canada. So
Yep.
we got Canada represented. And all right. So I think we're still letting people come in here, but
Yeah,
to
let a few
kind of
there
kick,
sacked.
yeah, kind of kick things off. We're going to be talking about this book here, and we have definitely a lot of things that we've you know looking at this book. There's just a lot of discussion starters, but to kind of kick off, I think just so people can hear a little bit about what the book's about, the sin of empathy. That title is very provocative because it says the sin of empathy. So just to kind of kick off the discussion here, uh, is it a good title? I know my reaction was a little negative when I first saw it. Did you feel like the title was a little too provocative when you first read it?
Yeah. So we'll get into this as we discuss the book. You've already said it. Like he does an excellent defense of why it's called what it's called. But personally, I thought he could have titled this something else. Because it is intentionally provocative, which he later admits, and what we'll get into that. But yeah, initially I was like, I don't think I'm going to agree with this book, but we'll see. What we'll get into the discussions of it. But you can see even by the artwork he shows as well, it's like a fluffy cloud, I'm guessing, holding a bomb. So
Yeah. Um, I feel like this is Canon Press, I believe. I
it is,
forgot
yeah.
what. Yeah,
Yep.
and I feel like they. I don't know all of their titles, but I feel like they might have like they might be more prone. This is Doug Wilson. He's kind of associated with that. They're a little
Yep.
bit more prone to provocative um, ways of communicating. We could say,
Good,
right?
good marketing, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and I know that can be a turnoff, but at the same time, sometimes it really causes people to think when they see something that's provocative. And yeah, I mean, I think what he said about this title. At first, I was a little bit wary of the title, but then when I read what he said, particularly at the end when he really gave his defense in the appendix,
yeah,
and he talked about how we will use terms like the sin of anger, and people will immediately know that you're talking about sinful anger, not all anger, because not all anger is sinful.
no,
Or if you're talking about the sin of sexual desire, people will know that you're talking about sinful sexual desire. It doesn't mean all sexual desire is sinful in and of itself. I thought that was a really good point.
yeah.
And didn't you have something about that you said too, that from that what he said
Yeah.
there?
So for me, I kind of went into this book knowing that it probably wouldn't be what was advertised. So I was coming in this thinking, he's going to say all things empathetic are bad. Um, that's not really what he's arguing for. We'll get into what he is arguing for as we
Yeah,
go through the book. But yeah, for me, my biggest criticism was he could have. And this is funny coming from me because I normally don't like caveat and stuff. I normally don't like over explaining things. But here is an example where I guess I'm eating my own words because I almost felt like he could have called it the sin of, and I'll tell you what later. But
okay.
yeah, he explained himself well, and we he talked about, what was it, Tozer you said, Tim, or was it
Uh, no, it's D.A. Carson.
Carson?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what it is.
So
Yeah,
D.A. Carson's book, The Intolerance of Tolerance. So Joe Rigney was basically saying, the main criticism I get anytime I've talked about this particular thing, because he's written articles on it since I forget way back when, with Desiring God. Um, his main criticism, he says, is people think he's been intentionally provocative, and he admits that to a degree he is, but he would argue that not all provocation is bad, to which I actually agree with him. So he slowly changed my mind in this book, but yeah,
yeah,
we've got plenty of good nuggets to get stuck into. So
yeah, yeah. And if people are coming in still, just let us know where you're listening from. I know, like I
mhm.
said, we've got someone from Canada here. Um, you're still in Ireland, right, Nicholas?
Yep, haven't moved yet.
You haven't moved yet.
I know
So,
I know one person's listening from California, so.
oh, there you go. So, how's the weather these days over where you are?
So this last couple of days really great. The sun's been out shining, which will probably mark Northern Ireland's like 3 days of good weather that we get throughout the year. But yeah, we've slowly been shifting from like the real cold weather into like springtime now is really starting to come out. Like people are out cutting their grass. So there's lovely fresh smells in there. So yeah, it's been nice. Apart from whenever you're,
It's actually getting a little warmer.
well,
Yeah,
that's
relatively.
the magical thing about Ireland. We can get the sun and it not get any warmer. But yeah, it's been a little bit better. But one of the
Well,
nice things about this time of year is kids out playing, people cutting their grass. No barbecue smells yet, but that season's coming. So yeah, I think when the good weather comes out, people's moods just lift. So
yes.
mm,
Absolutely. We have the same thing. We're both in these northern climates, so the time of year makes a big difference how much sunlight we get. It's not where I am, not as bad as where Dwayne is up in Canada.
yeah,
That's
he's
gotta
getting
be
it rough.
rough. Yeah. He
Yep.
does say though that maple season is here. I'm with you, Dwayne. I took my kids, I think it was last weekend, and we got maple creamies. It's maple flavored soft ice cream, and
Oh,
they actually on top of it at this place we went to, it's a farm, they take maple syrup that they whip into maple candy. It's like fudge, but I can't think of the texture, how to describe the texture. It's not hard, it's like fudge, but you
yeah.
can break it into pieces, and they break it into pieces and sprinkle it onto the ice cream, and it's just unbelievably good.
This
So
this isn't the same place that did the Irish waffle nachos, was it?
no, no, no. That was actually at a college. That was just a
Okay.
little cafe. Yeah, that was hilarious.
Yeah.
Irish nachos.
Yeah.
No, this was not cultural appropriation. This is actually the culture of where we live. Uh, maple cream. Now, I'd like to see a maple creamy in Ireland. That would be pretty cool to see your take
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah. We've got a few more people joined us now.
Yeah, I see we got Michigan here.
Mm-hmm.
So hello to Zach in Michigan, and it's probably pretty cold in that part of the country. Uh, then we're going down to Delaware here, Newcastle. I'm familiar with that area, generally speaking, because I'm from New Jersey, so that wasn't far away. So
Yeah.
hello over there in Delaware, and then we got
Mm.
Alabama. And now that we're getting farther south, and
Probably a bit warmer too.
yeah, Dan. Good to see you there in Alabama. Yeah, I would imagine, at least by my standards and your standards, it would feel pretty warm.
I would probably be burnt, yeah. The Irish burn just simply by looking at the sun. It's unfortunately a curse.
Yeah. Oh, and then we've got North Carolina. I just saw pop up here. Another pretty far south there, and then also uh, Evansville, Indiana. So
Well,
quite a variety of
hello, Jason. Good to see
locations.
you.
Yeah, great to see everybody here.
Yeah.
So again, we're talking about this book today, and in the comments, we'd love to get your input, feedback, questions that you have as we go along here. We're going to be giving our opinions, but it might bring up things that you have questions about, or
Yeah.
just you want to give your opinion in the comments. We love seeing that.
Hmm.
Um,
And if you
yeah,
haven't read it, let us know if you would read it as we're going through it. So let us know if we convince you to read it or not.
yeah. I mean, I really appreciate everybody kind of showing up. We've just started doing this show, and I feel like we have a group of people that are kind of joining us regularly. And
Hmm.
the funny thing about this, it seems like every time we've done this show, the longer we go, the more people join. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure what to do about that, because it doesn't matter when we start. We started later one time, uh,
Yeah,
and
that was last week.
it was the same thing where people took them a while to join, but the numbers kept going up even after we were, what were we talking for, over an hour and a half.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
still more people coming in. So
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe we just need to do like 3 hour discussions. But I don't know that I have the energy
I
or
think
the
I could do
time.
3 hours, but whether people want to listen to me for 3 hours is a different question.
I know I could talk for 3 hours
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, and we enjoy discussing things together, so it's really a joy to do this. But I'm always blown away that people keep watching us after an hour and a half or so. Yeah. So yeah, looking at what is being said in the comments here, I haven't read it. Someone says title doesn't really seem like something I'm interested in. Seems more like a hot take book. It in a way it is, but it's a very pertinent issue, and
Yeah.
you can kind of see that when you get into the topics. I think what I want to do actually is just show the table of contents here, and try to give a little bit of a just a little bit of a descriptor of each
Hmm.
chapter. So,
And it's really not a big book either, folks. So, like, if you're not someone that's a big reader, don't be put off by it.
oh yeah, like you actually said to someone you thought it was more of a booklet than a
Yeah,
book.
I'll admit I am like quite a voracious reader, and like I read a lot and I read quite quickly, but it flew by, if I'm honest.
Yeah, you're used to reading hundreds of pages in a book, but yeah, but like you're saying there, if you're not used to reading big books, or it's just not your thing, this
Hmm.
book is still very manageable.
Yep.
I have his other book up here. I'll pull it down now while we're talking. This is kind of the related book to this, even though he wrote this one, I think last year it came out,
Hmm.
and it's called Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. It's very similar size, I would say. This one
Yeah.
might be a little bit smaller actually than The Sin of Empathy, but they're both small books. So yeah, very manageable, pretty easy to read through. So the chapters here, first chapter, what does empathy mean? So that's where he's going to define the term empathy, because there are a lot of different definitions that are out there, and he really wants to try to hone it down and make it clear what he's talking about. Chapter
Yeah.
2, weaponizing pity, and that's talking about how something good like compassion can actually become a bad thing. So we'll talk about all of these subjects. We'll hit on all of them. Chapter 3 is the sins of empaths. So he's giving specific examples in this chapter of empathy gone wrong, how it can actually be misused, and he's giving examples. Chapter 4, Life Under the Progressive Gaze. And that's really hitting on like who do we think of as the world watching us, because a lot of times people will have a certain idea in their head of, when we say the world, we kind of actually envision a certain type of person. So he's going to hit on that issue, which is very, very
Yeah.
interesting and helpful. Chapter 5 is pretty self-explanatory. Feminism, the queen of the woke. He's tying in feminism with today's cultural trends and showing how they're related and how it's affected the church. And then chapter 6, in praise of compassion. And I love that he does this. When he gets
Yeah.
to the end of the book, he actually he doesn't just negatively say, "Don't be empathetic." He's actually going to really extol the virtuous use of compassion, and that's a great, really great application at the end of the book. And then he's got these two appendices, one on uh, his title, as we've already talked about a little bit,
Mainly the
and
criticisms he finds he faces.
yes, and he does a good job. He defends that quite thoroughly. I'm like you said, he's written on this stuff before, so I think he knew when he wrote this title he was going to get backlash. And
Yeah.
then the final appendix is actually it's kind of a spin-off of the Screw Tape Letters, is the way that he wrote this, and it's like an older demon writing to a demon who's beneath him,
Yeah.
and but it's talking about corrupt compassion, and it's dealing with the misuse of compassion. So we'll try to hit on all these topics at least a little bit as we go through this.
Yeah.
And still see people coming in here. We've got Colton just joined us. He says, "What's up,
What's up,
fellas?"
Colton?
Colton, I'm putting your name up there to let everyone know that you're coming on the program in a couple weeks. We can't wait
Mm-hmm.
to have call. We just got to find out some sort of really, really, divisive, heated topic that we can, really put Colton under the spotlight and see what he thinks about it, and see if we can get us all angry at each other. I'm sure that's what'll happen, right?
Oh yeah, Colton seems like that guy gets really heated.
I bet all of us can. I bet all of
Oh
us
yeah,
can.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, we saw how you felt last week when you started talking about Christ as King. I
I
mean,
get passionate. I get
you
passionate.
do. You
Yeah.
do.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think what would be good is to kind of go back through these chapters now,
Yes.
and we're going to highlight different things and bring up some of the some of the main topics and things that stood out to us. So the first chapter here, I'll bring it up here. It's called "What Does Empathy Mean?"
Well,
So go
sorry,
ahead.
Tim, not to cut you off. Just before you go to that, do you mind if I just read a little bit from the foreword from Rosaria?
Sure.
Yeah. So I highlighted this because I thought this was so. This is from Rosaria Butterfield, and
Hmm.
it's midway through her forward. She said, "When empathy is unhitched from the truth, it becomes an idol and a god, and feelings create tyrannical idols and gods. Because a Christian needs to distinguish the counterfeit from the real, Pastor Rigney begins by identifying how virtues go wrong, how untethered empathy devolves into manipulation, and before the reader balks at this, consider that the famed love chapter in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, begins with pervasive negativity. And then she goes on to talk about, love does not envy, love does not boast. And she finishes up by saying, knowing what love is not is necessary to understand what love is. So she then goes on to apply that this is what Joe Rigney's trying to do. So, like, we'll get into it now as we come to chapter one. But like, it was a good introduction because, as I say, when I first came into it, I was like, "Oh, is this going to be?" I think Dwayne even said, "Is this just going to be one of those hot tech books?" But no, it was written quite well, whether you fully agree with the man or not. So yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into it. But yeah, sorry, Tim, back to you on.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that forward up, because it shows even the forward has some interesting. information written by Rosaria Butterfield, who
Hmm.
I don't know how familiar everybody is with her. She wrote a pretty famous book called The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert
Hmm.
years ago, talking about her journey. She was a professor in a secular university. Um, I'm not sure if her topic or her role had to do with gender studies, but I know she was very she was living actually in a lesbian relationship
Yep.
and
Hmm.
very progressive, I guess you could say, in her outlook. And she ended up, I'll try to keep the story short, but she ended up somehow getting into a connection, into a conversation with a pastor who was really gracious but very truthful. And ultimately, God used that friendship to lead her to the Lord, and she completely changed her whole direction of life, committed her life to Christ, and she's written some great books.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have that as the forward, and then you get into the chapter one here, which is what does empathy mean? So that's a good question, and even I think he would say that's not an easy question to answer, right?
Yeah. So he actually brings up a really good point. Empathy isn't very well defined, and in fact, empathy can it really does depend on how the person's using empathy. That's why he talks about it's not necessarily empathy per se that he's after, but it's untethered empathy. That's why I thought the better title of the book would have been, the sin of untethered empathy, or But I think that's a little bit too close to because he was on Ali Beth Stuckey's channel before talking about this particular sin, and I believe she actually has a book titled that as well. So I understand like he couldn't have went that direction, but um,
And again, this is
yeah,
for Canon
empathy is just
Press. Canon Press. I think that it's a requirement that you title your book something that is going
some
to just
provocative.
cause everybody's hair to light on fire as soon as they read
Yeah,
it. Right?
yeah. Well, it's good marketing in a way because
It
like
is.
even if you don't get people to pick up and read the book, they get enough people talking about it that others will pick up and read the book. But yeah, going back to what we were saying, like empathy really isn't well defined. Like there's no true classical definition for what empathy is. Like yes, you can find a dictionary definition of it, but that is often not how it's used by
Mm.
people or what is meant by empathy. So it is a hard one to nail down. That's why, a famous line he repeats throughout the chapters a lot of times is he's not so interested in defining empathy, but rather how empathy is used.
Yeah, and with that, I think he does define it based on its current usage, and
Yeah.
I think one thing that you could say he kind of came down to as a definition. He contrasts it with sympathy, which is suffering with someone.
Yep.
Sympathy, suffering with, whereas empathy is suffering in another's misery or pain. And
Hmm.
I think that distinction that he makes for what he is trying to get at is a really good distinction. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
everybody uses empathy that way, but I see his point there that if you're suffering with someone, there's a level of detachment there. Whereas if you're suffering in, then you're kind of entering into to the point where you lose that sense of detachment from
Yeah.
the situation.
Yeah. So the way he's using empathy and the way he sees it being used is it, you use the exact words he used there, Tim, which is that detachment. Like he uses multiple examples, but one of them is you see someone in quicksand, and rather than placing one leg in with them and giving them your hand and tethering yourself to something sturdy on the outside to pull you both out, he sees the sin of empathy more as this person suffering, I'm going to jump in and suffer with them. So it's not about solutions, it's not about anything else other than elevating that person's perceived pain. So it becomes more about the feelings matter more than anything else. So,
Yeah.
I know maybe in the comments, some people maybe look at that and go, okay, well, that's just wordplay, or, that's semantics. But honestly, the more I read through the book, the more I read through the examples he was using, I can understand why he is going against this and why he's calling it the sin of empathy. Because sympathy, compassion, those are virtues. As where he sees sympathy as empathy the other way around. He sees empathy as a vice. He sees it as the elevation of feelings over uh concrete truth, or remaining detached enough to suffer with the person, but also to help them to provide a way out. So yeah, it's
Yeah. I I think like a good example of that distinction is like if someone when someone has gone through abuse, it can really just it's so traumatic for them,
yep.
and but it can also skew their viewpoint. So if you're suffering with someone, you're weeping with them, you hurt for them and what they've been through. But if
Mm-hmm.
you empathize, according to the way he's defining this, you actually take on their viewpoint.
Yep.
And so if they're bitter at people, if they're resentful, if they're like skewed in how they think about certain things, you're becoming that way yourself because you're literally taking on their whole mindset.
Yeah. And we see this in the later chapters. Like, I don't want to jump ahead, but like, just because of how well he connected the chapters, there's so many examples that are running through my head now that I want to talk about, because it's
We'll get
one
there.
of the things that I have seen happen. Sorry, what was that?
Oh, I just said we'll get there eventually.
Oh yeah, yeah. Eventually we will. But one of the things that really is pervasive that I have even seen in local churches around me is, now we don't quite use this term over here, but I have heard this term used before, and he uses it in the book, of like task force being established in churches. And it's it's maybe run by a group of women who have been through say sexual abuse, or maybe people that have been unfairly faced church hurt. But what often happens is, because empathy becomes the primary focus of these groups, it's all about this person's feelings. It's all about, we have to make sure that they're comforted. It becomes so elevated that what often ends up happening is the entire church becomes subordinate to this task force. So, maybe the pastor has preached a message that was insensitive towards, say, sexual abuse survivors or whatever it is. And what Joe Rigney is really getting at here is, that's not what we're called to do. We're called to have compassion on these people. So to suffer, as you said, with them. But we don't suffer in them. We don't enter into their worldview. We don't. And in a way, I know he didn't touch on this, but I heard him speak about this in an interview. It's also not our place to enter into someone else's suffering. Like, it makes no sense whenever you think about it. Like, for example, if Tim had gone through something traumatic, it makes no sense for me listening to him to enter into Tim's suffering as if I suffered the same thing with him. So I think it's, he makes really persuasive arguments throughout the book, and yes, it is intentionally provocative. Because from chapter one onwards, I was kind of like, I don't know, this sounds a bit like wordplay. It kind of sounds like semantics. It depends on how you use empathy versus compassion. But the more I read the book, the more I was like, okay, no, I see what he's getting at, and I see now why he's called it the sin of empathy.
Yeah. In my opinion, the book, when I kind of reflect back on it, first of all, I don't think it was actually that controversial.
No.
But part of that is I already agree with a lot of the basic premises that he's holding to, in terms of his values and his outlook on things. So that's part of it.
Mm.
But I also think that the book, it actually kind of, I don't know what it is, but it's like it keeps getting better. Is the way I would say it. At least
Hmm.
for me, I felt like, wow, as the further I got into it, the better it got on the whole.
Yeah,
On the whole, to
yeah,
the point where the final chapter was like this wonderful, like, oh, what a satisfying conclusion to the whole topic. I
Hmm.
really like that. So
Yeah.
yeah, actually, I have to. I wasn't going in thinking I was going to love it either, but I have to say, I would actually recommend this book. I really
So
would.
so would I. And one of the things, just in case, because I see your numbers are still going up. Um, Tim, can you jump to page 6 for me?
Yeah,
So just if you have
we'll
joined
try.
us, folks,
Mhm.
title of the book is The Sin of Empathy, and I just think that this quote here might be pertinent to read out just as you're joining us, because I'm going to read Colton's comment here, Tim, while you're looking for that. Empathy isn't always sinful, and I believe Joe Rigney has said that is true. Sorry, part of this is obscured for me here, but I could be wrong. Haven't read the book yet. Does he address the criticism heard from others? Yeah, so he's a bit at the back of the book. We'll come to that in time,
Mhm.
Colton. He does address the criticism, thankfully.
So you wanted page 6. Is there a certain
Yes, sorry,
quote
page
on there
6,
that
Tim.
you're
Yeah,
looking for?
yeah, sorry, page 6.
I hope this lines up with what you're looking for, but we can try to find it.
Well, if not, I can just read it off. It was more just so the audience can have it
Yeah.
off here as
Well,
well.
go ahead and start reading, and I'll see if I have it here.
Yep. So this is towards the end of page 6, at least in my Kindle version.
Okay.
Others were honestly confused by the definitions and terms in play. They struggled to even grasp the possibility that empathy could be dangerous or sinful. So I think that's a good thing to bring up, because you know I had first heard about the sin of empathy maybe a couple of years ago, and to be honest, hadn't really paid too much attention to it, because I did think it was merely wordplay until I read this book. And then I started listening to his interviews and I understood a bit more. But there is something about it, and this is what he argues. This is what he says. Empathy sounds like such a good virtue that people kind of balk at it, and it's like, well, how can you say then that the sin of empathy? But he goes on later to quote men like Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, where they all point out many different virtues. If they're elevated to the status of being a god, they very quickly become demons. And this is
Mhm.
something he says later on. It's not empathy. Sorry, folks, I'm losing my voice. It's not empathy as a whole he's going after. It's untethered empathy. And again, I know that might sound like semantics, but the more we go through the chapters of the book, the more we start even explaining some of the examples he uses. Maybe you'll see better what he's referring to.
Well, and let me go back to what I said was his defense in the appendix.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the sin of anger, and he was just saying when we use anger this way, when we use anger this way, nobody would have a reaction to that, or
Yep.
I don't. Most people wouldn't. But
No.
when you say empathy, people have a hard time, which shows you how much empathy has come to be extolled as a virtue in and of itself.
Yep.
And so what you're bringing out there, it's very important people understand what he's saying is anything to an excess or not tethered to God's truth.
Yep.
It can lose its virtuosity and actually become something. I mean, he calls it becomes a demon, I think is the way he puts it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can
Which
I
is
also
which is
mention?
borrowed language from Lewis, by the way. So.
Yeah, I want to mention too, because this first chapter actually is pretty small and there's
It's
a lot
just
more to get to.
introduction.
So, but I do want to mention, like, he did say something that I thought was interesting. He talks about how Bible translations, which I've talked about a lot on my channel,
Mm-hmm.
uh, typically um, they will translate Hebrews 4:15 as saying that Christ sympathizes with our weaknesses, and he brings out how the NIV, the updated version, and you'll notice
Yep.
here I have it on the top. We do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize. So it kind of shows you there that that has become really a buzzword, and the translators even chose to use that buzzword,
Mm.
even though all these other translations don't use it. I did find one other translation, though, just for the record, that uses it, and it's not a translation I'm really familiar with. But let me see. Yeah, it's right here, the Complete Jewish Bible,
Ah.
and it says in verse 15, "We do not have Kohen Gadol unable to empathize with our weakness." And that translation I think actually came out in 1998. So anyway, that's just some nerdy stuff about Bible translation there. But I do think that it shows um, that by and large, the translators have stuck with the word sympathy there.
Yeah.
And so it kind of does bolster his case a little bit that it's not just semantics because
No,
yeah,
because even, sorry, not to cut you off, Tom. I was just going to say,
okay,
even in this chapter, he talks about, he goes back to places in Deuteronomy where the Lord says, your eyes shall have no pity for them, you shall not spare them, because these were punishments meted out by God that, had they transgressed the law or they had led Israel away after false gods, God basically says, put them to death. And he says, your eyes shall not pity them, you shall not spare them. So, although this is Old Testament, and I know a lot of people immediately jump in and go, yes, that was the Old Testament, but it doesn't remove the principle that Rigney's arguing from. He is arguing to say that even God himself says that there are times where pity is not good. There are times where compassion is not good. Because if you have pity towards someone, that is deserving of whatever punishment they are, and you spare them from that punishment, you've elevated that pity above justice. And that's what Rigney's coming at. Is I think he talks about it being from like a shift of compassion towards empathy. And that then, Tim, ties into what you were saying about where he reads from the NIV and he says, look here how even the NIV now have switched it to empathize versus sympathize. So I think it's a good point, and I think especially in our modern culture, we really do elevate empathy to such a high degree that there are even people in the church that talk about, oh, I'm an empath. Like I feel so deeply for how, and then in a sense that is true. There's one person in my life who I know, for lack of a better word, like I don't really like using it, but like is an empath. But
yeah,
they feel so deeply that when other people hurt, it's almost like they are in the grieving process with them. And I see what it does to them, and I'm like, that's not good. That's not healthy for you. Like you shouldn't allow someone else's
yeah,
pain to affect you so deeply. And I know that probably sounds like it's it's not compassionate or it's not, but it's exactly what Rigney's talking about, because the pain they're going through, the suffering they're going for, is untethered. They
yeah.
have got nothing to hold on to keep them secure. They're not anchored to the shore. They've just jumped into the sea with the drowning person, and that's the danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what it kind of brings up for me when you say that is that, and he doesn't really address this in the book, but people do have different tendencies, and I do think that some people are maybe more prone to certain, they have, again, it can be a good thing. Like I think of how the Bible talks about the gift of mercy. I think it uses that
Yeah,
expression. So
yeah,
so that's
bowels of mercy.
that must mean that some people are actually, that's a strength of theirs, and other
Hmm.
people struggle to have the mercy they ought to have.
Yeah,
So I think this book is just written from a good, like, he's a teacher,
yeah,
he's a guy with wisdom, and so he's able to kind of bring a little bit of balance and corrective to maybe some of those extremes, even though some people, I think those tendencies, as long as they bring them under the submission of the Lord and His truth, those can be good things.
yeah.
And I think Joe Rigney would agree with that.
Oh yeah,
One other thing too that I wanted to highlight about chapter one, and then we will move on,
because this
is
is just the introduction.
but then again, we don't have a topic for next week, so maybe we'll just
We
do
can still do
part
that.
two next week, right? But empathy, the way he's defining it, and he may have even said something like this, but it occurred to me that empathy uh, really reflects our pluralistic mindset, that everybody has his own truth, and so, like, I think that's what he's kind of getting, he's really helping to flesh out here, is that the problem is sympathy looks at everybody, according to the way he defines it, as you may be hurt and I should care about that, I should have compassion, but I see an overarching truth that I'm tethered to.
Yeah.
Empathy says, what is your truth? I want to enter into your truth, your perspective. And then you end up with all these different perspectives that, and you can see it in our culture. It's
Yeah.
led to, like, it's really a question of who are you going to empathize with, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody has
Which,
grievances.
yeah, which he does point out. He points out in the
Yeah.
second appendix, where he's writing I think he calls his demon mugwort versus Uncle Screwtape. Um, but he talks about being enmeshed in one another. Like, we all just become this, like, one sort of like enmeshment where, like, there is no longer any truth outside of ourselves. It's just whoever you enter into suffering with. And Tim, as you pointed out, like, who you choosing to enter suffering with? Is it LGBT groups? Is it minority groups? Is
Mhm.
it groups that have had church hurt, sexual abuse hurt? So some people might look at this and think, I'm saying that those things aren't true or they aren't real. What I'm saying is, if you are not tethered to God's truth while you're trying to have compassion with these people, you will very easily elevate empathy to the point where it becomes a demon, where it becomes this. It's the overriding, all that matters is that this person feels empathized with. And the problem with that is, you then, if you're a leader in the church, or, whatever position you serve in, you lose any type of direction in your ministry because you are now being steered. And he uses this language a lot. He uses the church being steered by empathy and how it's a dangerous thing because, I don't need to keep repeating myself, but I'm going to. Any virtue, whenever it's elevated to the place of God, becomes a demon. And it's
which
just
is
true.
which is exactly what chapter 2. So good segue.
Yep.
Chapter 2 is really talking about that topic. He really does talk about how something like even a high virtue. And actually, it's been a while since I read this particular chapter, but I have it written down, like a something that's a high virtue can end up becoming demonic.
Yep.
Um, and it's something that's counterintuitive, because we think if something's a high virtue, then it's a high virtue. But maybe another way to look at this, just to kind of put a different spin on it for everybody, tie it in with last week. We were talking about, people that, I don't even want to bring up the name because we've already talked about this, but people that we could say they're hateful, but it's like, well, hatred has its place. Actually, it's even in the
It does.
Bible, right?
Yep.
Like, the idea of hatred, but it can obviously be demonic. And I think a lot of us, we're intuitive about that. We're like, oh, of course hatred can be demonic, but we don't necessarily think of compassion and empathy as ever being demonic, right?
No, because, like, think about, and I'm talking to the audience here as well, but think about how many times in your life you've maybe heard the phrase, like, oh, there's no such thing as too much compassion. You can never be too, sympathetic. You can never be too loving. Actually, you can. And even in the loving part, because you can love someone to such a great degree that you neglect to, mete out justice perhaps where it needs to be
Mm.
meted out. And that's a problem, because you're elevating one thing over another, and whenever you elevate that thing, you bring it to a place where it is the ultimate overriding thing, which is what Rigney says. What we're meant to have as our overriding thing is God and his law. So yeah, it's one of those things of, there are certain vices out there, like, you know not even vices, but, like, say for example, Tim, you already used anger. Like, most people just intuitively know, yeah, okay, don't sin in your anger. That doesn't mean I can't be angry at all, because there's such a thing as righteous anger. But
Hmm.
yet, for whatever reason, whenever you say the sin of empathy, like, and I did this myself, it's very quick to go, really, empathy?
It's such a good thing.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is the chapter too, where he uses a portion of one of C.S. Lewis's books.
Hmm.
You know, I'm trying to think. Is it the Great Divorce that he
It's
references?
the Great Divorce. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
just looking for the quote.
yeah, and kind of what comes out there. I'm going to try to think of how he was communicating it, but that and maybe you'll be able to like find a specific quote, but it's like
Hmm.
this idea, like, because in Lewis's story he's showing what people are actually thinking, when you're thinking about people who are in heaven and you're having conversations with and seeing their outlook versus people that are in hell and are not able to go to heaven. But he kind of basically says that when this person who is unable to go to heaven is demanding others' compassion in a way, and that they're so self-imprisoned. The way he puts it is like it's akin to hell being able to veto heaven.
Yeah.
And I think
Hmm.
that's a key phrase there, that
Yep.
like uh, hell can actually shake its fist at God and why he does things and demand that God do things a certain way. Is that
Hmm.
kind of base? Is that, would you say,
Yeah.
kind of what he's
So
hitting at there?
pretty much, I'm not going to read this quote because I just realized that it's actually people are not going to be able to see that very well. But it's quite long and it
Yeah,
goes
true.
over quite a few pages. But essentially, in the book, Pam is a woman who has I think she's lost quite a few children, I believe. But
Mm,
there's one child she loses in particular, and she eventually it's been a while since I've read this book, so I'm only going by the context of what Rigney has here. So if anyone in the audience is like, that's not quite right, correct me in the comments. But she eventually, I believe, dies. Her brother comes to see her, as in, like, he's already passed on. He's in this heavenly place that Lewis is writing about. He comes to get her, but before he can get her to enter heaven, he kind of has to show her that her love is misplaced, her love is misguided. So along the way that they're walking towards this mountain, which is the mountain of God, obviously, um, he keeps trying to show her that her love is misplaced because Pam is completely mourning her son, and she keeps, fighting with her brother, and she's like, "How dare you, say that my grief is bad? How dare you say this, that, and the other?"
mm,
But essentially, what it boils down to, and what her brother eventually kind of gets her to see, is you value the love of your son to such a detriment that you would rather have your son with you in hell than your son be in heaven and you not with him. Like, it's a disordered love. It's love taken to the place where it's no longer a virtue; it becomes a demon. And that's what I think Rigney was pointing out. That he was pointing out that while Lewis didn't call it the sin of empathy, Lewis was showing that we can have disordered desires, even good desires.
mm. You can see how that would play out too in the real world,
Hmm.
because I think what that really hits on is there are people who are really capitalizing, which is going to get actually to the next chapter. But the idea that you want this person to so um, delve into the way that you're feeling, that it's like you want them to be miserable in a way. And
Yeah,
like you're not even thinking about the other person anymore, really.
yeah. Like, at one point, I believe Rigney actually uses the language. It's like a hostage situation. Like, the person so demands.
Yeah.
Oh, have I frozen with you?
Nope. You're, at least on my end, I still see you moving.
Oh, okay. It's just frozen in the studio, and then okay, it'll
Oh,
probably
I'm
pick up
sorry.
later. Oh,
Yeah.
it's fine as long as the audience can see slash hear. Well, even hear me is probably better than seeing me. But I completely threw myself off where I was going there. What was I saying?
Oh, I forgot too. We we'll think of
Yeah.
it as soon
Well,
as we bring it back up.
it'll come back.
Yeah,
It'll come back.
yeah. But I was just gonna say too, and for the chapter that we're getting into here, chapter 3. Yeah, we were talking about how we capitalize on the feelings of others, and people will use that to try to, they want you to be, uh, miserable, really.
Yeah, I remember now what I was going to say. He
Yeah.
he compares it to a hostage situation where the the person suffering sort of holds you hostage to the fact that, well, if you don't enter into to my to my pain with me, you're not really being compassionate, you're not really being kind. So it's not enough for them to have someone who, has tethered himself to something secure and he's reaching in with one hand to like to have compassion on you, but yet help pull you out of that mire or that mud or whatever it is. That's not enough for them. It becomes almost a hostage situation. So
Yeah. Yeah. And so with this next chapter, uh, he's going to talk about the sins of empaths. That's what it's titled. But
hmm
it's examples of, like, in our culture, uh, there are ways in which this really goes awry. The idea of empathy, and the example that I'll bring up that he uses, I guess Rigney had written some stuff about COVID, and
hmm
he got some pushback from David French.
yes,
Uh, uh, and what David French thought is the problem wasn't excessive empathy. David French thought the problem was selective empathy. But here's how it was being misused. People were actually death shaming. They were like,
yeah,
if you didn't get the vaccine, it's your own fault. And
yep,
so they didn't have any empathy for those people who didn't get the vaccine.
no,
And so David French says, well, the problem had to do with selective empathy.
yep,
But Rigney pushes back, like, he comes back to that, and he says the reason it's selective is because it was excessive. They
yep,
were so wrapped up in, like, feeling the way they did about, you know how you should deal with COVID and all these people who are going to get this disease,
yep,
that they ended up hating people who didn't take their viewpoint.
yeah. It did, and it's in the. I believe it's in the very same, like, well, maybe it's the page over. I'm not sure. I'll double check in a moment. But the other abuse of it that happened at that stage too uh,
By the
was
way,
an
I'm just
abuse.
for a second going to put the screen on you while I close the door. That I hear some noise coming out. So go ahead.
No worries, we're going. So there you go, folks. Now you get to enjoy my ugly Irish mug. Um, so one of the other things that they had really, or what Rigney pointed out, was there was also the abuse of language, like, take the vaccine in order to love your neighbor. So similar language to what he was using earlier, whenever he talked about it being, a hostage situation. You were placed in a very almost hostage like situation where you were being told it's not loving, it's not empathetic if you don't take this vaccine, if you don't take this shot. And it's just this is what we can see. Like, if we're going to be honest, this is what we can see by it being elevated to such a position where it becomes abusive and it becomes controlling. And I think most people's understanding of empathy is a good thing, because it can be a good thing. So if you look at it and you understand it to be a good thing, and then you see it being used and abused, and you can see that there are abuses of it, it's only fair that we're intellectually honest enough to turn around and say, okay, well, then that is a sin of empathy. That's where empathy is being abused. You're muted.
By the way, I just
There
realized
we
that
go.
I was muted, and also that I
I don't
didn't
know why
have.
I whispered you're muted. The audience would have heard me anyway.
I I noticed that I wasn't, for some reason, I wasn't seeing the chat advance, and so people had written some things that I didn't catch, and I think we answered Colton's question about, does he address uh, the criticism that empathy? Did you say something about that,
Well,
Nicholas?
I said we would whenever we come towards the appendix. Not that we've actually answered his question
Okay.
yet, but we will.
If you stick with us for 2 hours, you'll get to hear your question answered.
Well, maybe
Yeah.
even when Colton's back in 2 weeks, we can fill him in.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's a good way to keep people watching. That question you have? We'll answer it at the very end.
Tune in
Um,
2 weeks time.
yeah. And then he had the other, does he address the criticism Christ is empathetic, which I think we kind of hit on with that NIV quote, that actually
Yeah,
a lot of the translations don't use that word. That would be a newer take
yeah,
on that
yeah.
word.
Well, it would, because it is better rendered as sympathize.
Yeah. The King James, and I might actually, I know we're backtracking a little bit, but since I
Yeah, that's
missed
okay. Or
it,
go ahead.
I'll show the King James here.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what it says. Oops, there we go. It says, "For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities." So
Yep.
nothing that would, you know, necessitate having to use the word empathy.
No.
Just being touched with the feeling, and I think sympathy is a perfectly uh, adequate word to describe how Jesus. Oh, I know. I thought of something that's a good way to think about this. When Jesus, I can think of a situation where he was going to heal someone, and he
Mm-hmm.
actually asked them, "Do you want to be healed?" And I think that's such a good example of, like, there's a sense in which, like, he really cares about their situation, and yet at the same time he's saying, do you actually want this healing?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the problem, is some people don't want to be healed.
Yeah.
Like, deep down, they kind of like being in this, for whatever reason, situation that they're in. You know what I
Well,
mean?
he doesn't address it fully in this book, but he does kind of touch on it a little bit. What one of the problems, whenever people are so caught up in, I need people to be and they do use the term empathetic. You
Yep.
notice they rarely use the term, "Oh, I just need some compassion," or "I just need some sympathy." It often is, "I just need empathy," because empathy, everything sort of bows to empathy.
Right.
But anyway, where I'm going with this is, some people really just get in victim mode and they like staying there. And it's, I don't necessarily like having to say that, but it's true. There have been people in my life that I've known who are perpetual victims, and they love keeping themselves in that place, and they refuse all forms of help unless
Mm.
it's the form of help they want. And that's going back to what Lewis was talking about with that, with his character Pam in The Great Divorce. Is like, she was refusing all her brother's help to try and get her to heaven, because, as he put it to her, she would far rather have her son with her in hell than for her son to be in heaven without her.
Mm. Yeah. And just again hitting on what this chapter is talking about. We're in chapter 3 right now, is what we're
Mm-hmm.
going over, the sins of empaths. Um, People will empathize to the point where they will actually become, and I'm now kind of shifting here to, because he's talking about empaths. So these are not the people who are in the emotional state, or the suffering. They're people who are trying to suffer in their
With,
emotional
sorry,
state,
and yeah,
to
and
suffer
not
in
with.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what happens, as he points out, is um, it's actually people who have that excessive empathy who can become very hateful, ironically. This is kind of the one of the things that's surprising about human tendencies and human nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we've seen it actually in our culture. As
Yep.
much as our culture extols feeling for other people, we have a lot of bitterness, and, like, we hate these people, and it's just like we're constantly going after a certain group. And again, he was using COVID to show that, that
Mm-hmm.
there was definitely a lot of
Yeah.
harshness, callousness, even, like, oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
that person. And we see that a lot today. Well, if if they don't feel for these people here, then they deserve whatever they get.
Yep. And then that's what happens whenever he talks about that enmeshment, because what suffering with someone with compassion is, we keep using the same example, but I'm tethered to the shore by a rope, and I reach in and I throw a life preserver out to you, Tim, and I hold on to the life preserver to try and pull you in as well. I'm tethered by something outside of myself, something greater, something stronger. That should be God and his word. But the problem with those people that, the funny thing is that they are empaths. They are people that are meant to be, loving and kind. They often do become more hateful and more prideful because in their empathy they lose all boundaries. They lose all sense of what is good and true and right, and all it becomes about is this per group. So, like, I forget whether it's this chapter or not, but in particular, Rigney's talking about women who say perhaps put off childbirth until maybe their late 30s, and then they never can have children.
Mm.
He says then those are, and it's true because statistically we can see this, these are then the types of women that try to bring out their mothering nurture, or their mothering instincts and their nurturing instincts. They then try to bring them out to marginalized groups, and they become like this fierce mama bear for, like, perhaps groups like LGBT. So it's, they
Mm.
then become such staunch warriors for these marginalized groups that if
Yeah.
you don't love the way that mama bear tells you to love,
Right.
then you're not loving. So therefore, she has no problem wishing you fall down a flight of stairs, or you wishing whatever type of horrible thing it is. But that's often how they get caught up in that sort of like hatred. It's because they lose all sense of boundary. They lose every sort of sense of right and wrong.
I think that's in the chapter on feminism,
Oh, right. Well, then I've
where
just
that.
jumped it.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We're giving people previews. It's fine. We're all of the topics in his book linked together,
That's what I
so there's
say.
going to
Like,
be
it's
some overlap.
so, but that I find though, but that's what made the book very compelling. It's
Mm.
his chapters tied together so well. Like,
Yeah.
it's very rare you do get an author that tie. Sometimes in books, I find chapters are so disjointed. You're kind of like, that would have been better placed back here. But I have to give Rigney's credit. Very good writer. Very good writer.
Mm. Yeah, I think so too. Now, the fourth chapter, I'll pull it up here, titled
Mm.
"Life Under the Progressive Gaze." I'm sure you liked this chapter, didn't you? This resonated with you, huh?
Are you trying to say I'm a white supremacist, Tim?
No, it's not that. I just
But do
uh,
you know what I'm referencing by that?
no, actually,
Oh, okay. So,
maybe
in
you
this
mean,
chapter,
is it because of what he ties the progressive gaze
yeah, so he
to?
was saying that, while he uses the term the progressive gaze, he was saying, that black authors often feel like they're writing for a white audience.
Yeah.
So therefore they call it the white gaze. So in this chapter, he's calling it the progressive gaze. But also, Tim, just for you on, just a shout out to Your Missing Mother and Feckless Cowboy and Inferno Core. There were three of my people from X. So they've joined us.
Nice. Great to see. Thank you for joining us. And
Hmm.
feel free to uh, give any input or questions in the live chat there as we go along here. We're talking about the fourth chapter of the book, The Sin of Empathy. We're just kind of going, giving some highlights and giving our thoughts on it.
Hmm.
Life Under the Progressive Gaze is what it's called. And the reason I thought you liked this is I think you actually on X put a quotation from this particular chapter on
Yeah,
X. So I
yeah.
think, and I probably can pull that up at some
I was
point
going to say
here.
if you can, because I can pull it up here, but then the audience won't see it.
Yeah, I can do that. Sure. It'll take me just a little bit here to find it, but I think I can find it.
Hmm.
Do you know what page it's on generally?
Oh, no, sorry. I thought you were looking for my tweet.
Oh no, I was just going to show the quote itself from the book.
Oh, all right. Well, then, no, because I pulled the
You
quote from
didn't.
two different places.
Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, it's a little hard because I have a lot of quotes that I highlighted, so I'm just kind of
I
trying
have
to
a
look
lot in
through.
this chapter as well, but
Yeah. Yeah.
what do you see? If I can, while you're doing that, Tim, and I don't want us to have dead air here, but hopefully I can go back to my tweet pretty quickly. Um, then that way I can just read it out.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So it says the progressive gaze explains the great variety of characters in these common scenarios. Out in the open, wolves and worldly apostles, wolves in sheep's clothing and false prophets, real victims and inflated victims, sincere advocates and opportunistic cry bullies, naive peacemakers and empathetic peacemongers, confused sheep and refugees from the world, respectable hirelings and decent shepherds with hireling tendencies or hireling moments, reactive shepherds who saw the issues while resisting foolishly, and sober minded shepherds who were faithful at their post.
And I do have that up here now,
Yep,
the
perfect.
actual quote from the book. Yes. So, yeah, the progressive gaze. I thought that was an interesting take, and I think it's the fact that he drew that from what black author. He actually mentions the author Toni Morrison,
Yes.
and I don't actually know the author, but apparently he was saying that when people write in, I assume, in American context, uh, they're having to consider themselves under they have to, like, instead of just writing from their own perspective, like as a black person, they're kind of thinking, okay, I have to be mindful of the white culture at large. I think that's what the original
Yeah,
concept
yeah, which,
was.
in itself is, it's not the place to get into the topic right now, but it's even
We kind of did that last week in a way, right?
yeah, I was going to say that that even in itself is, a result of DEI. So, but we can get into that at a later date.
Hmm. So, but the parallel is that, like, he's assuming, like, there's this group of people judging, so to speak, from a
Yep.
certain viewpoint, and when we're acting as Christians and we think about, like, we should be a testimony to the world around us, the phrases that he uses are you thinking, when you think of the world, are you thinking of the coastal elite, or are
Yep.
you thinking of the coal miner?
Yep.
Because both could be in the world, right? It's not like, one is necessarily, when you think of a non-Christian, it has to be a person in the urban setting on the coast.
Hmm.
It could be someone in the middle of the country where we
Yep.
live, right?
Yep. Hmm.
And yet in our Christianity, and the other thing, we should backtrack a little bit here. He's really he starts out this chapter talking about Aaron Renn's three worlds framework, where
Yes.
the and I don't particularly fully subscribe to this viewpoint, but this is what he's using, is this idea that there was a negative, no, excuse me, a positive world toward Christianity,
Yep.
uh, up until the early 90s. And then for a while, there was a neutral world.
Yep.
And then now we've shifted into a negative world toward Christianity. I think that's a little bit of a oversimplification of it, because in America, we do have a lot of variety of what's happening right now in terms of viewpoints. But let's just go with it, because the real
Yeah.
point he's making is, the point that we've gotten to at this point in our culture, um, we tend to, like, operate, and I do understand this. We tend to operate like, who are we trying to cater to in the language that we use? Who is it we're trying to be sensitive to? And what you end up doing without realizing it is you're being sensitive to a certain group of people that you think are always watching
Yeah.
what you say. But in reality, why are we assuming that? Like,
Mm.
there's all different people that you might be like, and I think this gets into the topic of, where do you live? He never brings this up, but I think it's a very pertinent topic. Right now, I live in rural New Hampshire, and
Hmm.
I don't know what it's like where you live, Nicholas, but I mean, rural New Hampshire is very different than New York City or Boston. I mean, if you were a Christian in those cities, you would probably be encountering certain kinds of unbelievers and be thinking, oh, this is how I need to interact with people.
Hmm.
But when you're living in rural areas, it's so different. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
depending on the part of the country you're in.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on this, but I took this particular part, that, like, the part of the reason why I quoted this is because whenever we come to, like, we see there the term cry bullies or naive peacemakers or empathetic peacemongers, and then it goes on to the confused sheep, the respectable hirelings, and the decent shepherds. The thing I think that stood out most to me here was the fact that the decent shepherds, and I went on, I pulled two quotes, and I from separate places in the book, and I quoted them later as well.
Mm.
And I said I completely understand where Rigney's coming from, because he's pointing here and he said often the church by and large is being steered under the progressive gaze, because you do have decent men, decent shepherds, who perhaps in their own local churches or whatever do have these groups like I talked about earlier. Like there's task groups
Hmm.
assigned within the church that, oh, make sure you don't speak too hard in this, or make sure you don't, say too much about that, you'll offend this group. And if you have shepherds that are not willing to say no, you're not going to put any restraints on the word of God here. If you've got shepherds though, but who are so empathetic, where it's like, oh, these poor people, they need a voice. These poor people, they need a voice. That shepherd then becomes shackled, and even though he's a decent shepherd, so to speak, he then shackles the word of God and doesn't preach the whole counsel. So the church gets steered in that manner. And I took, you talk about Ren's three worlds. I don't necessarily, I don't know if I would subscribe to it fully either, but I do think the overall gist of it is true. Like I can, I was 4 years old whenever he presented a positive world. Um, but I do have fond memories of younger days where there seemed to be in the culture more of a respectability about Christianity,
Hmm.
as where nowadays it really does seem like it's more of a.
It
But I
depends on
think
it depends on the
things,
segment of society too that you're talking. Because I think what a lot of
yeah,
the people are alluding to are like the media, for example.
hmm,
But even there, like when I say media, if we're talking about movies, I don't know. Has there ever been in a time in my life? I mean, I'll admit, I would say if you look at movies in the 80s, they probably were more inclined to a favorable view of Christianity than they are today, for
yeah,
sure. But they were not nearly as Christian oriented as movies in the 40s.
yeah.
But honestly, the movies in the 40s, this is what I mean. It's complicated
I,
because
I think
the
it also
four,
goes in cycles.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's almost a whole separate
Hmm.
subject. But
Yeah.
kind of getting back here,
Hmm.
what ultimately it does get at is that yes, we do feel the pressure right now, like kind of the overall cultural mood
Yep.
is that there are certain things we should be very sensitive toward,
Hmm.
and the question is that really when we compare it to scripture, are these the ways we should talk about issues? Just because the
Hmm.
culture gets offended by certain things easily
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we should necessarily so here's an example. Just I like this example he used. I think I'm quoting him here. He talks about Peter in the Bible and how there were Jewish
Yeah.
believers who were like looking down, and Peter felt like he was under their gaze. He called it the circumcised gaze, I think is what he called it.
He did.
And
Yeah.
it's like, but it's a point that it
Hmm.
hits home. Like Peter is feeling this pressure from a whole group of Christians that, oh, I better not associate with these people right now because they're watching me. And it made him feel guilty for doing something he shouldn't feel guilty doing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, 100%. And like, it's the reason why I think this chapter hit home a lot more for me is I have witnessed this in churches I've been a part of, where, maybe the pastor or the elders have had, oh, we can't really say such and such because we know we have a member that's gone through whatever, whatever. And it's like,
Hmm.
well, if you're not willing or bold enough to say that, I don't really know what that says too much about, your ability to be behind the pulpit. Like that's another story. But it's and this is why I think the title of the book did win me over, because it
Mhm.
truly is the sin of empathy. You can elevate empathy to such a place
Yeah.
where, as Lewis says, you elevate it to the position of a god and it becomes a demon. So, Tim, just before we go on, could you pull up just the second comment there from Cowboy for me? Oh, sorry,
Um,
it's now his third one because he's popped another one in. It's his
uh,
comment about Rigney
Rigney
is
is
completely
completely
misusing.
misusing the term empath. That one.
Yeah, yeah. So this is one of my best friends, an ex, great dude. He's been talking about empathy, since good knows how long. We had a conversation last week about it as well, and he said he's been on it, since the 90s. Um, so the thing is here, though, unless this has been maybe in like a video or something, in this book in particular, Rigney doesn't talk too much about empaths. His problem is more with the 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 elevating of empathy to such a degree that it's no longer a virtue, it's a vice. But I don't think he's necessarily talking about empaths too much because, like, I believe, I think it's maybe towards the end of the book, he does say that empathy does have its good points, but he would prefer to call it compassion or, so.
Hmm.
But good seeing you, brother. Keep chatting.
Yeah, I mean these definitions they can get very complicated depending on
Hmm.
what your reference point is and what
Yeah.
the source material that you're reading and all of that. I
You
mean,
see,
which
that's
I think is
exactly
one of
what.
the points that Rigney makes. Actually, yeah,
Exactly, yeah, that's what he was saying. It's so, like, the term empathy itself is actually quite nebulous. Like, it's quite hard to nail down. That's
yeah.
why he's less concerned with an actual definition of empathy versus how people use empathy.
Right. He gives
But
actual examples in the book of like he doesn't just make blanket statements, by the way.
no,
He
yeah, yeah,
actually says, here's an example of it actually being used in this way, and here's an example of it being used in the exact opposite way.
yep,
So like he has really done his homework with this.
yeah.
So
Well, he's been.
I'm just gonna mention that because I can tell we're not going to get to all the chapters today. Um, what we'll do is we'll kind of end here at chapter 4. The next chapter is about feminism, which is a great topic in and of itself. So next week,
I'll set the cat among the pigeons.
we're going to start off talking about chapter 5 and feminism, and kind of get to the rest of the book there. But I think we have some things we're still talking about here. So
Yeah.
you remember what you're going to
Tim,
say?
can you go to page 81 for me, and then it's at the very bottom, and it'll move on to page 82, and I just want to read out a quote here that I've highlighted.
Sure, I can try.
Well,
Page eight,
if you can't, I can pull it up
page
anyway.
81. You say
Yeah, bottom of
okay.
page 81.
Okay, and what has the quote start?
Terms like abuse and trauma.
All right, terms like abuse and trauma. Um, yeah,
Different page number?
it's possible, but let me just pull it up, and then
Yeah.
we'll see if we can find it. I have some other things highlighted too, so
Hmm.
I don't know if it's
I,
before
I
or
just
after.
I just particularly love this because this was a part in the book where I was like, yeah, okay, that's perfect.
Hmm.
Okay, hang on. It's not appearing on the studio for me, so I'll have to bring my phone over. Hang on.
Yeah, yeah. This is the
Okay, so
problem we're dealing with.
flick one, yeah.
A little
Yes, I
more.
think you actually have the same thing highlighted there.
Oh, okay. I just didn't realize. Oh, yeah, I see it now. Yeah.
Yeah.
After the effectiveness of these initial movements, however, the
Yep.
definition of victimhood was expanded through language inflation and concept creep. Terms
Yep.
like abuse and trauma were enlarged to encompass a wider variety of experiences.
Yep. Then, sorry, just because it goes over a page. No longer did abuse refer to a pattern of physical or sexual violence. Now, criticism, rebuke, correction, or even disagreement could be regarded as abuse. No longer did trauma refer to physical damage or an event causing severe emotional distress outside the range of usual human experience. Instead, any, and that's in italics by the way, any emotional distress was regarded as harmful, and empathy demanded that Christians comfort, nurture, and accommodate the traumatized. And I think that if you were to summarize Rigney's whole book in a nutshell, that's it.
Hmm.
That's where he's really coming at it because
Hmm.
I'm sure everybody, even those in the audience, have had experiences in churches where they've maybe experienced genuine church hurt. But then you get people that say they've experienced church hurt, And what
Mm.
maybe simply happened was they were corrected, or they were told, okay, look, we don't do that here. Whatever it was, experiences like that, and he even uses the term later on in the chapter. He says they get re-narrated because someone comes alongside them and says, actually, you suffered abuse there. You were mishandled. You suffered abuse. That pastor abused you. Those elders abused you. And it's exactly what Rigney was saying there. It becomes this idea of concept creep, where like these concepts creep an inch forward to they encompass a whole sphere of things. Things like trauma and abuse
Mm.
used to have very specific meanings. Now anything could be abusive. Like Tim could kick me out of the stream right now, and I could go online and say, Tim abused me on his face. He kicked me out, and there could be a whole uproar over it. But did you actually abuse me? No, and that's why I think Rigney hit the nail on the head with that. Like I highlighted it for a reason because it stood out so well to me. But I think it just, if I had to summarize that book and say to people what it's about, I would actually point them to that and say, read that, and you'll understand what the book's about.
Yeah, that's a good point. And people that are in ministry in the world that we live in right now, it's very very much part of the experience that we have because I mean, yeah, there's so much offense out there. And as a pastor, and I myself have done pastoral work for years,
Yep,
people will accuse you of abuse uh, if they don't think that you handled things exactly the way that they think you should have handled them.
yep,
And it's like, hold on here, yeah. So I think that really does hit
and
on
it's
it,
such
and
charged terms.
they really, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That being said, I found this book very, it shines a light on me too. That's one thing I really liked because, first of all, sometimes we don't handle things perfectly, and even if it's not abuse, we could still say take a step back and say I could have handled that better.
yeah,
But the thing that also really I think I love that he brought this out, and it's in this chapter. He talks about the fact that there are wolves. And
mm,
wolves are, we know what those people talk about all the time. There are wolves in the church. But he says there are also hirelings. And and hirelings are people that they flee when the danger comes. They're not really caring for the flock. They're not really, and I love that image that he gives. And then he even goes on to say later there are some pastors who have hireling tendencies, and I love that because it helps us to take a look. And again, I'm saying this as a pastor myself.
mm,
Wow, okay, maybe I'm not a wolf and maybe I'm not a full-fledged hireling, but I might have hireling tendencies,
yeah,
that because what he kind of brings out is hirelings aren't necessarily in it for the money, but they're in it for some sort of gain, which could
yep,
be social approval, for example.
mm-hmm,
And that's really something a lot of us pastors have to take a long, hard look at.
yeah,
That we look at those pastors over there who they're offending people, and maybe they're not doing things in the right way. On the other hand, if we're overly reluctant to offend, we may also be not protecting the flock, and I think that's unfortunately what's happening in our culture right now because
mm-hmm,
people are pressuring us never to offend, but then
yep,
they're leading us astray.
yeah. And just I flipped to page 87, Tim, just because it talks specifically what you're talking about. And it says here the net of effect of these dynamics is to render certain subjects off limits in the presence of victims, lest they be disrespected, triggered, or even traumatized. Um, and I can see again, Cowboy here. He said every time I preached a sermon in First Corinthians 11, somebody, and he air quotes, suffered church abuse. Tim, you've said similar. I know I'm friendly with a lot of pastors in my life, and I've been fortunate enough to interview them for different things. Like I used to have a radio program here locally,
Hmm.
um, And I used to love interviewing these men and see why they got involved in the ministry and stuff. And I remember the one question I normally tried to end off with, and I realized after like two or three of them, it wasn't a good question to end on, because I noticed the answer was always negative. And I always, in the beginning, I always tried to ask them, if there was one thing you could change about your job, what would it be? And without fail, almost all of them said, I wish that whenever I preached the whole counsel of God, I didn't have so many of my own flock hating me. Like
Wow.
that, those are strong words. But like you will have people in your congregation who will despise you, who will, and maybe even those are too strong a terms, but this is how this felt to those men. Those
Mm,
men felt so deeply wounded that there they were doing their job, preaching the whole counsel of God out of love, and I'm going to assume that was their motive, out of love.
mm,
But yet you had people in the congregation despising them for doing their job. And you know, it's those men that will be counted as faithful towards God. Because Tim, you said it there yourself. Maybe some pastors aren't in it for the money, but maybe they do have Ireland tendencies in other areas. Maybe it's seen as a respectable job,
mhm.
or it gives maybe status in the community, or whatever it is. At the end of the day, whenever Jesus restored Peter, he asked him three times, Peter, do you love me?
Mm,
That was the question. Three times, do you love me?
mm,
That's what a pastor's meant to do. He's meant to love God, and
mm.
only out of his love for God can love flow for the sheep.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, you're not fit to be in the ministry. And I know we're going off on a slightly different topic here, but I just want to wrap that up because,
It's actually very, very much what he says. What he actually gets to is we need to
Mhm.
be under the divine gaze.
Yep,
We need to, instead of thinking of the progressive gaze, and Peter was under the circumcised gaze, he
yep,
says we need to see ourselves under the divine gaze.
yep.
That's who we fear above all else.
Well, that's exactly it. Because I can tell you now, the fear of man is very real. Like I'm not a qualified minister. There's a reason I chose the term layman, for a reason. I want to be both a layman in how I relay my apologetics, but also a lot of my learning is self learning.
Mm,
Um, but one of the things I used to do years ago was for a non-denominational church. Was I was a lay preacher for them, and they give me a lot of freedom in preaching, and I thank the Lord for that, and it helped me grow. Growed, helped me grow. But over the years, I became convinced I'm not qualified for this. I shouldn't be doing this. I haven't been called to it. And part of the reason that came from was I remember what it was like being in that non denominational church where I had personal convictions and I was convinced that this is what the Word of God says. But I, time after time, felt almost, and I never did it, praise the Lord, but I'm just pointing out how it can be. I felt almost time and time again, maybe I shouldn't preach that because I know they don't really hold to that, or
mm.
that's such a strong impulse. That is such a strong feeling. So if you're not tethered to God, if you're not tethered to no, I fear Him over you in the pews, it would be very easy to go, I'm just not going to speak in that passage. I'm not going to speak in that doctrine. But
Yeah.
praise the Lord, they never had any complaints with my teaching, even though at times I
Mm.
taught things they didn't particularly subscribe to. They often thanked me and they said, "Thank you. That must have been hard." So God will always reward His shepherds. And that's why, just if there's anyone watching today, and then they are, like I know Colton and Cowboy here, like they have pastored before Tim, you've pastored. Just keep that encouragement. Keep yourself under the divine gaze. Keep yourself under the gaze of God.
Amen. Amen. That's such a great way to kind of wind things down here. So next week we've got two more chapters we didn't get to, but I think this was the episode today was really kind of just giving our overall take, and I think you can
Yep.
tell we do recommend the book. Both of
Yep.
us have said that. So if you're interested in this topic and kind of just reading it for yourself, and there's a lot we didn't talk about. You can read it in the book here, The Sin of
Hmm.
Empathy. by Joe Rigney,
Yep.
and I think you'll find it quite edifying and insightful in many ways. But next week
And
we'll
just
talk
to
about.
say,
Yep.
sorry, I was just going to say, if anyone is interested, you can get both this book and his previous book that Tim had a while ago there. If you've got Kindle Unlimited, you can currently get both books for free on Kindle Unlimited. So
The leadership and emotional sabotage
yep,
and
you
the
can
sin
get
of
this
empathy.
and the Sin
Yep.
of Empathy for free currently.
Wow. Okay.
Yep.
Good to know. And so next week we'll talk about the next chapter, feminism, and the final chapter on extolling compassion,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll wrap it all up. So
Mm-hmm.
I think still plenty to talk about next week, but I think this was great for today, and we had a great audience as always. It's been great to see everybody sticking with us and writing their comments in the comment section.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, we're going to come up with some names for this program and try to get
Yeah. So if you
feedback
have
from
any,
people too, right?
if you have any, submit them.
Yeah, if you have any good
Otherwise,
good
this really
names.
is going to be the no name show.
Oh well. Doesn't really need a name.
No, it doesn't, but it would be cool if we had one. But
It might help, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
when we're trying to promote and tell people about it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to let the audience go now, and we'll plan to see you in a week from today,
Mm-hmm.
Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And I don't know what time it's going to be for you next week. Or you have a time change coming up next week?
It should be 9 o'clock, I think.
Okay, so
Yeah,
9 o'clock Ireland time.
Ireland time.
I don't know what you call it. But anyway, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.